So milling rough lumber, or basically taking wood from looking something like this to something like this, is an essential woodworking skill, but it can be pretty tricky depending on what tools you have available. And so in this video, I'm gonna go through my process of milling lumber from start to finish, including some tips in case you don't have access to a jointer like I do. Yeah, man, it's good. So I guess before we dive into my milling process, let's talk about why milling is so important in the first place. Because it might seem like that lumber you buy from your local home center or woodworking store is good enough, but really for the best results in woodworking, you need pretty much perfectly square material. Because if your material isn't flat, straight, and square, you're gonna end up with gaps in your glue-ups, all of your joinery is gonna be thrown off. Obviously things like cabinet boxes will be out of square, and you're just gonna have a bad time. And you might think that just buying pre-milled lumber is enough, and you can sometimes get away with this, but a lot of times that S3S or S4S material you're gonna buy from your local lumber dealer or woodworking store isn't really gonna be perfectly flat or square. And that's because wood is a natural product. It moves around based on temperature and humidity. So when you bring that board from wherever you bought it from into your shop or garage or whatever, that board is most likely gonna move a little bit. And that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of woodworkers move towards rough lumber as they progress in their career, because you just have more material to play with when it comes to milling. Because if you buy that S3S or S4S board and it's already milled down to, let's say, 3/4 of an inch thick, well, if it's not perfectly flat when it gets back to your shop, you don't really have a lot of extra material left to mill that board flat and square without making it too thin for whatever project you're working on. Not to mention that rough lumber is usually cheaper because there's less labor involved, obviously, in producing that material, and it's usually more readily available. Most lumber yards don't really stock S3S or S4S material. They'll usually take that rough material and mill it for you, but that also comes with an additional charge. So when it comes to the specific tools I use to mill lumber, it basically consists of 3 main machines. I've got my jointer, my planer, and my table saw. And this is what I like to call my triangle of milling. And that's because during the milling process, I am constantly moving in a kind of circular motion, usually starting at the jointer, then going to the planer, and then finishing up at the table saw. And so let's break down what each of these machines does during the milling process, because I know when I was getting started, the jointer and planer really confused me because it seemed like they kind of do the same thing, but they don't. They have a few key differences. So we'll start here at the jointer, which is usually my first step in the milling process. And the jointer's job is to flatten one face or one edge. And the jointer is designed in a way where the in-feed table is slightly lower than the out-feed table. That is adjustable here. You can change your depth of cut. And as you run that piece of material over the in-feed table, it crosses over the cutter head, which is perfectly even with the out-feed table, and the board ends up flat. One thing the jointer can't really do though is to bring 2 faces or edges into parallel, and that's where the planer comes in. So then the planer's job is to bring 2 faces into parallel. And as long as the bottom face that's running along the table here is nice and flat, the top face will also end up nice and flat. That being said, if the board is twisted or bowed, it will also come out of the planer twisted and bowed. It'll just have 2 nice clean faces. And that's because the planer really just follows the shape of the board. It doesn't really flatten material. And depending on the project, having 2 clean faces might be good enough. If there's a slight twist or bow in something like a butcher block glue up or a big workbench top or even a cutting board, you can probably clamp out some minor bowing or twisting and still end up with a fine finished piece. And this is when I'll do what I call skip planing, which is basically just running a board through the planer, taking a light pass, flipping the board between passes, and that'll usually kind of knock off any really high spots. And even if the board doesn't end up perfectly flat, I know that during that glue up, any of those inconsistencies can probably be clamped out. And then the final tool in the milling triangle is the table saw, and the table saw's job is to bring that last edge, because we've already flattened one face at the jointer, squared up and flattened one edge at the jointer, and then brought the other face into parallel at the planer. And so there's that one ragged edge left, and we can set our table saw to whatever width we want our board to end up at, and then make a rip cut. And again, as long as our table saw blade is set square and our fence is set up correctly, we'll end up with a board that is perfectly square on 4 sides. You can also bring that other edge into parallel with the planer, and depending on how wide or thick a board is, I definitely use the planer for that sometimes, because it can be a little bit easier to get a super clean edge on the planer than it can be on the table saw, just depending on how thick your stock is, what kind of blade you're running, all that kind of stuff. And you might be thinking, well, why couldn't I just run my rough board along the table saw fence to square up that edge? And that's because, like the planer, all the table saw really does is make one edge parallel with the other edge that's up along the fence. So if your board has a crook along its length, basically if it's curved along its length, the table saw is just gonna follow that. let's take a second to talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Eufy and their new Expert Secure video alarm system. So I've been looking for an alarm system for our tiny house for a while now, and when Eufy reached out about their new Expert Secure system, I knew it'd be the perfect fit. So the system is built around the new Homebase Pro, which provides up to 16 terabytes of local storage for the security videos, plus the Homebase has 4G connectivity and a 24-hour battery backup, so your monitoring will keep working even if the power goes out. Speaking of monitoring, Eufy's Expert Monitoring Service provides full coverage including fire, medical, intrusion, and more, and the monitoring includes round-the-clock human oversight and immediate action if needed. The Expert Secure system has sensor options for everything you need to monitor your home while you're away, and I installed quite a few in the tiny house, including entry sensors on the doors and windows, motion sensors, smoke alarms, and a flood and freeze sensor. I also installed the video doorbell, which provides a great view of the exterior of the house, plus another camera in the guest bedroom where I'll be setting up a home office. Best of all, the installation process was a breeze since everything was pre-configured in the Eufy app. And now I'm able to see exactly what's going on in the tiny house and here at my shop since I use Eufy security at both locations. And these security systems really give me so much peace of mind since I can monitor things while I'm away instead of having to worry about coming into a fire, a break-in, or a flood like happened here at the shop. And I definitely think I'm still a little traumatized from that. So if you'd like to learn more, click the link in the description below. And if you purchase before October 31st, you'll get 3 months of free service, a complimentary smoke alarm and yard sign, and 15% off any other add-ons, all included with your order. Thanks again to Eufy for sponsoring this week's video, and let's get back to work. And so now that we've talked about the specific milling tools and their individual jobs, let's go through the milling process step by step from start to finish, starting with a rough board, ending up with a perfectly S4S board. And I'll make sure to give you plenty of tips along the way so you can still do this process even without a jointer. And so as I mentioned, I start my milling process here at the jointer, and the first step in the milling process is usually going to be to flatten one face, because that will be our kind of reference surface for the rest of the process, because once we have one face flat, we can square up one adjacent edge, and then from there we can move on through the milling process. So the first thing to look out for when doing this kind of milling work on the jointer or the planer is going to be your grain orientation, and it can sometimes be a little bit tricky to see your grain orientation when the board is this rough, so usually I'll take kind of a light first pass and see if I'm getting any kind of tear out or things like that. But this process is especially important if you have a jointer or a planer with straight knives. And in case you're not familiar, there are basically two different styles of cutter heads on jointers or planers. You've got straight knives, which means there's one straight blade across the entire width of the cutter head. And then you've got spiral or helical head cutter heads. And instead of one straight knife doing all the cutting work, you have a bunch of smaller, usually carbide inserts doing the cuts. So each one of those inserts is making smaller cuts. The inserts are usually set at a bit of an angle, so they're making a shear cut. And all of this adds up to usually a much cleaner surface finish coming off the jointer and the planer. You'll usually end up with less tear out. And also helical or spiral cutter heads put a lot less strain on the motor because that cutting force is broken up into smaller chunks rather than one big cut being taken. And so one great way to upgrade your surface finish without having to buy an entire new machine is to replace your straight cutter head with a spiral cutter head, and even on something like a lunchbox planer, you can end up with really nice results, and it'll help put less strain on that motor since it's a lot less powerful than a motor in something like a floor standing planer or jointer. But anyway, once I've figured out my grain orientation, I want to orient my boards so those wood fibers are flowing with the rotation of the cutter head instead of against. And obviously, if you're trying to cut those fibers with the cutter head running against the grain, that's going to lead to a lot more tear out. And again, that's especially important if your jointer or planer have straight knives. The next thing you want to look for when running a board across the jointer is if it has any kind of twist or bow. And figuring that out is pretty easy. You can usually just tap the corners. And as we can see, this board has a little bit of twist to it because it rocks back and forth corner to corner. If the board is twisted like this one, I'll usually just put pressure kind of in the middle of the board, trying to keep even pressure on both of those high corners. And after a couple passes, that twist will usually be removed. If the board is cupped, I usually have the concave side facing the bed of the jointer because then I know I have two contact points at all times. If you put the convex side down on the bed, the board can get a little bit rocky depending on how severe the cupping is. Now the orientation of the board, if the board is bowed, will really depend on your exact jointer, because if you think about it, if your board is longer than the infeed and outfeed length of your jointer, at some point that board is going to be hanging off the edge of your jointer. And that's one of the reasons why I usually like to break down all of my parts to rough length before doing the milling work, because all of these issues, whether that's cupping or twisting or bowing, are really compounded the longer the board is. Also, the longer the board is during milling, if it's severely bowed, you're gonna have to remove a lot more material. And depending on how thick your board is to begin with, you might not have that much material to play with. And this is one of the reasons why when I was looking for a jointer, one of my main criteria was getting the longest in-feed and out-feed tables I could find, because that just makes your milling process a lot more accurate, especially when you're working with longer boards. Anyway, once I run that first face on the jointer, I make sure to make some sort of mark on it. I make this kind of Jesus fish looking mark. I don't know where I learned this, but it's very quick to make, very distinct. And this is obviously pretty important when you're working with rough material, but it's even more important if you have material that's already been surfaced, because it can be really hard to tell which face was the one you jointed versus the one that came from your lumber dealer. So that was my process for flattening one face with the jointer. But again, what if you don't have a jointer? And I'm sure any of you with a planer have already seen this, but this is a planer sled, and it's a very simple thing. It's just a piece of sheet good material. I used MDF in this case. I cut it just a little bit narrower than my planer, and then the length will really depend on what material you want to flatten, because obviously if you're trying to flatten a bunch of 2-foot long boards, you wouldn't want a 6 or 8 foot long planer sled. But if you do need to flatten a 6-foot board, this 4-foot planer sled would not work. And so these planer sleds are also great even if you have a jointer, because a lot of times, especially if you have a smaller 6-inch jointer, the material you want to joint is going to be wider than your jointer can handle. So a planer sled would be a great option there as well. And then once I had the planer sled base cut to size, I added a little fence to the front of the planer sled, and I cut this to be about 1/2 inch above the surface of the planer sled, and I made sure to screw it in from the end of the sled, so that way in case I ever plane it down, I'm not going to hit those screws with my planer cutter head. But so now to set up my piece on my planer sled, I want to sit the sled on my workbench, and then just like when I was working on the jointer, check for twisting, bowing, cupping, all that kind of stuff. And so the idea here is we're gonna shim any of these high or low spots to keep those areas from rocking, because that's what would typically happen when you're using the planer. And by doing that, we'll end up with one nice flat face. And so then once you have your board shimmed up so that it's not rocking anywhere, it's nice and solid on your sled, you can go ahead and hot glue it into place. Also, I should mention these little cordless hot glue guns are awesome. I found this one on Amazon. It works with my DeWalt batteries, and not having to deal with a cord when you're doing this kind of stuff really saves a bunch of time. And then now that this board is secured to the sled, all I need to do is run it through the planer until this top face is totally cleaned up, and that'll mean this face is totally flat. Then I can just pop the board off the planer sled, flip it over, and then run it through the planer to bring the other face into parallel. And then I figure while I'm working here at the planer, I might as well give you some planer tips. So number one is how to set your depth of cut. The way I do it is I lower the table of the planer until I can slide the board through without it touching the cutter head. I slide the board through to its thickest part, usually somewhere in the middle. And then I turn the planer on and raise the table until the board just starts to slide through. And that's essentially my 0. And so then I know from there, after each pass, I can turn the handle half or a whole turn, depending on how much material I'm trying to remove. And I'm not going to bog down the planer on that first pass, which is something I definitely did a lot when I was first getting started. Another common issue people run into when using a planer is dealing with planer snipe. And this is when the cutter head on the planer cuts a little too deep at the very beginning and very end of the board. And there are a few different strategies you can use to deal with this. First, you can slightly lift the board as you're feeding it in and as it's coming out of the planer, and that alone will help to keep that cutter head from gouging into the beginning and end of your board. You can also add some outfeed support like this roller stand, and that'll really help with planer snipe when the board is exiting the planer. One thing that hugely reduces snipe is if you run boards one after another. That way the cutter head really doesn't have a chance to dig in because it's already cutting that next piece. And if you've watched any of my videos with me planing in them, you'll see that I do this all the time. I pretty much only ever run one board at a time through the planer. And by butting those pieces up end to end as I run them through the planer, it virtually eliminates snipe. I'll also usually mill up one extra piece that I can run through at the very beginning and very end, and that extra piece will get most of the snipe. Last, if you have some extra material, you could always cut your boards about 4 to 6 inches longer than they need to be, and then just cut off those areas of snipe after doing your milling. Now let's say you don't have a planer or a jointer, how would you go about flattening a board? Well, obviously hand tools have existed for hundreds of years. People have been doing it that way for a long, long time. Obviously takes quite a while. It's also pretty difficult to get super accurate results, in my opinion, just purely flattening by hand, but it's very doable, and this is a great option if you don't have a ton of room and if you're working in a much smaller space where you got to pack everything up at the end of each work session. Another great option for flattening one face on especially larger boards like slabs and things like that are router sleds. And these can be really simple to build, but they do make a huge mess. So I don't tend to use a router sled very much. I have a CNC, which is essentially like a motorized router sled, so I can use that for flattening larger slabs if I need to. And so once we have one flat face, that brings us to the next step in the milling process, which is squaring up and flattening one edge. And once again, the jointer excels at this, and this is why I love having a jointer so much, because I can go ahead and flatten one face and square up one edge all at the same time, and then move everything over to the planer to bring the other face into parallel. That being said, if you're using a jointer, you need to make sure to check that fence for square very regularly, because depending on the jointer, that fence can get bumped out of square, and that essentially defeats the purpose of using the jointer. So I double check mine for square on pretty much every project. Another pro tip is if I'm doing a big panel glue up where I know I'm going to have a bunch of jointed edges right next to each other, I'll run the edges of those boards on the jointer again before the glue up once I've figured out the orientation of the boards in the panel glue up. And if I joint the edges of the pieces that are going to meet up in the glue up with the opposing faces running along the jointer fence, I can ensure that even if the jointer fence is slightly out of square, any error will be negated by running opposing faces. And as soon as I started doing this, my panel glue ups got a lot flatter, because even if your jointer fence is 89.7 degrees versus 90 degrees, if you have 5 or 6 boards that you're gluing up, your panel is going to be bowed in by a degree or two by the time you get everything clamped together. And just like when I joint the faces of boards, I'll go ahead and make a mark on the edge that I've jointed, just so I can keep easy track of that, so I know which edge to run up against the table saw fence later. So thankfully there are tons of alternatives for straightening and squaring up an edge without a jointer in the woodworking world. Again, hand tools are a great choice here. I think this is much more forgiving than trying to flatten an entire board. If you get a longer plane like a jack plane or a jointer plane, you should be able to get your process down. And as long as you have your sharpening system dialed in as well, you'll get really good results. Another great option for getting a straight edge on your board is to use the table saw. But you can't just run your board up against the fence, because again, the table saw just cuts parallel to the edge that's running along the fence. So if that edge isn't straight, your board isn't going to end up straight. So instead, you can use some sort of jig. This is a tapering jig, but really this is a lot more fancy than you need. You could actually just take that planer sled that we made before, add some double stick tape to secure the board down to the sled. You want the edge to be overhanging enough to where the straight edge of the planer sled can run up against the fence, and then you can just run the whole thing through the table saw to get a pretty much perfect edge. One big recommendation is if you're going to be doing this kind of work on the table saw, make sure to install a dedicated ripping blade, because the last thing you want is to have some sort of blade designed for cross-cutting installed, because that's going to just add a lot of resistance when you're making that cut, and you're not going to get as good of a result. Another great option for making a straight line rip is to use a track saw. And I use a track saw a ton when I'm breaking down rough material, because depending on the size of the piece, it can be a lot easier to bring the saw to the workpiece rather than bringing the workpiece to the tool. For instance, if I'm trying to cut a straight edge on a big slab, obviously running that on the jointer would be pretty awkward. Blade choice is another big consideration when you're making straight line rips with the track saw, because a lot of times track saws will come with blades that are either combination blades or more oriented for cutting sheet goods, because I know a lot of track saws are used for that. But if you're going to be doing a lot of ripping with your track saw, I would definitely invest in a good rip blade for that saw, because it'll massively reduce the strain that's put on the motor, meaning you can make the cuts faster and you'll just get better results. One other great method for jointing the edge of a board is to use a router table. You can offset the infeed and outfeed faces of the router table fence, and if you install a bit with a long enough cutting area, preferably a spiral bit, you can get results really similar to a jointer. Yeah, man, it's good. And so then once that last edge is ripped square, you have a board that is milled S4S, or square 4 sides, and it's ready to be cut to length, start adding joinery, all that kind of stuff. So now to answer a question that I think a lot of woodworkers have, do you really need a jointer? Because obviously I've shown some alternative methods, and I would say it depends. If you're working with a lot of rough lumber on every project, I think a jointer is going to save you a ton of time, because I use that planer sled for one board, but imagine if your project called for like 10 boards. It would take a really long time. And another thing I haven't really mentioned is that after doing this initial milling process, you really want to let these boards hang out in your shop for a few days and let all of those freshly exposed faces acclimate, because most likely these boards are going to move a little bit again, which means ideally you would repeat this whole milling process one more time. Now, the second time around, it doesn't take nearly as long if you're starting with rough lumber, because the second time you're barely removing any material. But you can imagine if you had to go through all of that planer sled work again, it would take a really long time. And if space is your primary concern, you might want to check out a combination jointer planer machine. I know these aren't as popular here in the US for whatever reason, but they're a really cool idea because you have both machines in one footprint. You can switch back and forth between planer mode and jointer mode, and I think that would be a great option for people who have a little bit of a tighter shop. If price is your issue, jointers have been being made for a long time at this point, so there's a huge used market for jointers. My first jointer I bought used and it was great, saved a ton of money versus buying new, and it served me well for years before I decided to upgrade to something with a helical head. If you guys have any questions about my milling process, I'd be happy to answer them down in the comments. I try to respond to as many comments as I can. I'll also link to the specific tools I used in this video in the video description below. If it's your first time here, go ahead and get subscribed and ring the notification bell so you don't miss my future videos. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, happy building.